Hey everybody, here we are with the first video for the agriculture unit 4. Here we're going to go through the basics. We're going to look at things like intensive and extensive agriculture. We're going to look at commercial subsistence, and then we're going to look at the types of agriculture that we have in the world today, or at least as far as they relate to our course. So here we go. Part of the basics is understanding these two types of agriculture, which are intensive and extensive. Now, we have our two examples here, 1 and 2. And on one hand, the lighter shade, we're looking at labor. This is going to be our labor input or cost. And then we have the land relative to that labor. Now, in intensive farming, we're going to have lots of land. We're going to have lots of labor and input, rather, for relatively small plots of land. So here we have roughly even amounts of labor compared to the amounts of land that we have. There's a lot of work that's going into this type of farming, and that work can be manual labor, it can be actually physical work that has to be done, or it can be cost, right? The amount of money that has to go into this type of farming, paying for pesticides, fertilizers, etc. On the other end, we have our extensive agriculture, where we are looking at relatively little inputs, relatively little labor compared to larger plots of land. So really we are going to see this difference in land. That's going to be our first look to. It's going to be the amount of land that's being used to cultivate crops or to raise agricultural products. And then the second part we're looking at is the labor input. Is there a lot of work and effort and input, capital money that's going into this particular type of farming? Or is there relatively little work and labor that's having to go into this type of farming to produce the products that we want? These are the first two basic ideas behind agricultural land use, right? Are we going to be intensive or extensive agricultural workers? The second part, and the one that many of us have seen time and time again through 7th grade history, 8th grade history, so on and so forth, is this distinction between commercial and subsistence agriculture. Now, commercial agriculture, just like a commercial, is looking to sell products, right? It's for the purpose of producing profit. So in a commercial agricultural practice, we're looking at farming or agricultural work whose purpose, right, the reason that they're performing that agricultural process or processes is to produce profits, to make profits and to sell goods to markets. Subsistence agriculture, on the other hand, is in order to subsist, to survive, right? So this is farming where we're raising crops and livestock to be used directly by the farmer, their family, or their community, right? The purpose behind the two different types of agriculture are different and distinct. And that's one of these big distinctions between commercial and subsistence farming. Commercial farming is going to have a separate purpose. The whole point of growing the products is to sell those products in the long term or in the short term to produce profits and to make money. Subsistence farming, the end goal is to provide enough food, sustenance to keep that family or community afloat to survive. Now we have lots of types of farming, specific examples of farming that happen in the world that are going to be subsistence or commercial, that will be intensive or extensive. So we're going to look at those next. The first of these that we're looking at is what we call pastoral nomadism. And here we have our map, our regions, or these are also our agricultural regions. So we can see that we have these darker shades here. That's going to be our locations for pastoral nomadic practices. And we can see we have in large parts of Africa, Northern Africa, and Southern Africa, in the Middle East, and in parts of Central Asia. Now, these are going to be rugged terrains right here in the northern part of Africa and in the Middle East. We have lots of desert environments. It's very hard and very harsh. And so that means we have a lack of arable land. Now, pastoral nomadism itself is about the following or herding of animals as they travel from place to place. Right, that's the nomadic part. The pastoral part has to do with the animals, caring for them, or otherwise making sure that they don't die, and then doing so in a nomadic way where you're following those animals or leading those animals to and fro to graze and to eat, right? So you can eventually eat them later on. Now, naturally, this is a difficult process. You're not going to be able to keep hundreds or thousands of animals, or at least nothing so much as to make mad bank on this particular type of practice, right? And these are very rough terrains too, right? Mountainous areas and desert areas, so there's not a lot of leeway in terms of overextending oneself. So this is going to be one of our subsistence practices. And as you might tell, because we have this wide range of people, and because these animals are moving from place to place, they're going to have to do so over a large area of land. So this is one of our subsistence and extensive practices. The second practice is what we call shifting cultivation. And this one's tricky because there's a lot of subtypes. So there are three terms that reference shifting cultivation in general, three kind of subcategories. One is slash and burn, which is the most common that we cover in this course. In slash and burn agriculture, we have three major steps. Clear existing vegetation. So you see a forest, you have to clear that all out to make room for the farmland that you need to provide. We can notice here we're in tropical regions, areas around the equator, and these are all areas that have some form of forestry. Right here in the Amazon basin, the Amazon rainforest, as it were, and then other forest and jungle areas in Indonesia and in Central Africa, right? Notice this is Central Africa, right? It's not going to be the northern part with the Sahara Desert. It's not going to be the southern part that's a little mountainous, more rugged. It's these central tropical areas that have lots of vegetation. So we have to clear that out first. That's step number one. Step number two, you're not going to be able to get all the vegetation out, so you have to burn the rest of it. This does two things. One, it gets rid of the remaining vegetation, so it's going to make that land flat and suitable for farming for the most part. Two, the ash that is left over is actually providing a good amount of fertilizer and is actually pretty good for growing crops on that land. That's step two. Step one, we clear the vegetation. Step two, we burn the rest and we use the ash as fertilizer. Step three is to cultivate until the nutrients are gone, until they're depleted. They're going to use and reuse that plot of land until it's no longer arable. And then that closes out our first steps: clearing the vegetation, burning the rest, and using the ash for fertilizer, cultivating on that land until the nutrients are depleted, and then the hidden step number four, we move on to a new plot of land and repeat the process all over again. This is part of the unsustainability of certain agricultural practices, right? Because if you keep depleting these plots of land, you're going to exceed that carrying capacity sooner rather than later, because there's eventually going to be spots that you need to return to, but which maybe don't have the nutrients left in the soil to adequately sustain a revamp, a part two of the agricultural processes you need, or that land is just going to become desertified, right? It's going to end up more like a desert where the nutrients and the soil quality decrease greatly. The other type that we call this is also Swidden. There's just three different ways that it's referred to: shifting cultivation, slash and burn, Swidden. But these are the steps. Oh, because of the processes, almost forgot. And burning the vegetation, right? There's some aspect here of coming into land and clearing the trees and clearing the forest that's needed, or that's needing to be cleared. But because of the work that's being done, in terms of the fire that's being produced, in terms of the amount of people that are at work here, it is a subsistence practice. And this is the most common practice we see in this particular region of the world. But it's also extensive, right? Just like pastoral nomadism. So it's going to be one of these extensive practices that's also subsistence in nature. The third type of farming that we look at, or type of agriculture we look at, is what we call Mediterranean agriculture, so called for its origins in the, you guessed it, Mediterranean. All right, so it's not specific to the region, but it's more specific to the climactic conditions. Right, relatively mild winters, pretty temperate spaces, and mild summers, and a unique soil quality. So we see this in the southern parts of Europe and the northern most parts of Africa along the coast of the Mediterranean. Over time, especially after the Columbian Exchange, we saw these agricultural products, grapes and pistachios and things like that, find themselves in new locations. But of course, it's a climactic condition that needs to be met to produce quality Mediterranean agricultural products, at least at a point where it's profitable, right? So we only have certain spaces, one of them being the western coast of the U.S., we don't want to say southwestern because it's going to include Texas, and because the U.S. is weird, but really we can just think of California, right? That's going to be our spot in the U.S., as well as parts of Chile, parts of South Africa, the southern coast of Australia, and of course the origin point, right? The surrounding Mediterranean area, northern Africa, Morocco, southern Europe with Spain, Italy, and then southeastern Europe, like Turkey. This is going to be one of our intensive agricultural practices. A lot of land and labor has to go into these processes. You think of things like grapes, which are a very profitable industry by themselves and as processed goods into wine and juices and things like that. But in order to collect those, in order to keep those produced in a way that will be likable to consumers, right, in a way that people want to buy them, that's going to take manual labor, right? You can't just throw a bunch of machines into collecting the grapes. A lot of this is going to be harvested by hand in some cases. And more than that, a lot of inputs are required, right? Naturally, we had this large water sources here in the Mediterranean, and that has to be the case in these other areas too, right? So we have lots of irrigation, lots of technology goes into these processes. Because of that, and because of their luxury quality, right? Because these are not necessary goods; these are luxury goods, as we would call them, or luxury crops, specialty crops. This is also going to be a commercial practice. So it's intensive because of the amount of work and labor that goes into them. Commercial because of their purpose, right? The purpose of these products is not to, right, have a farmer eat 10,000 grapes a day, but to sell those grapes for a profit to markets. The next type of agriculture we're looking at is plantation agriculture. This we usually associate with the United States and the Caribbean, at least when we're thinking 1700s, 1800s, which is not the wrong way to think about it, right? We definitely had plantations in the southern U.S. And in the Caribbean. But really, this is a matter of the climate conditions, right? Having a more tropical climate was going to be needed. More than that, we are looking at luxury products here. All right, we can notice here we're looking at things like sugar, bananas, cotton, coconuts, vanilla, all things that go into quality of life conditions that are not necessarily needed to survive, right? To subsist. More than that, a lot of these products, you think of bananas, coffee, these are very sensitive products, right? Tea, and these are crops and agricultural goods that need to be collected very carefully. If you think of bananas, they bruise very easily. A lot of work, while it's been automated with the introduction of mechanization, or things after the Industrial Revolution that contributed to the second agricultural revolution, we still have a lot of work that has to be done by hand just because of the nature of these goods. So it is going to require lots of land, lots of labor, manual labor in this case, and lots of inputs. Again, you need high quality machines and checks and people who are going in by hand to collect some of these goods. They're luxury products themselves, so they're going to cost more. So on the one hand, it is intensive agriculture because of the amount of input that goes into it, and it's also commercial agriculture because the whole point of these is to produce a profit by selling them, by selling these goods, right? Woe to the person, W-O-E, who consumes solely coffee, though some of you may be in that boat. The next type of farming we're looking at is wet rice farming. And here we have our own regions of the world. We're looking at, in this case, particularly South and Southeast Asia. These are our highest concentrations now. This is the highest concentration we have today for wet rice farming. And there is wet rice and dry rice farming. We're just focusing on the wet rice farming here. And this wet rice farming typically includes what we call terracing, right? It involves this carving into hillsides, right, as we can see here, where they're making the land more flat, right, especially in Southeast Asia. We're thinking of places like Vietnam and the Philippines. We have lots of hilly areas, lots of mountainous, rugged areas that aren't suited for farming. Now, it's not the same issue as slash and burn agriculture, because we're not worried about forests at this point. We can clear the forest, we can clear the vegetation. The issue is that the land isn't flat, right? So there has to be a way, or there had to be a way, to create flat land to increase the surface area available for planting rice. And we can see that here, right? These fields are flooded, and that's part of the cultivation of wet rice farming. The fields are flooded after the rice is planted into the ground. And then eventually the fields have to get drained, and then the rice is collected, and so on and so forth. There are consequences here, of course, which is a separate video. We'll go over that later. Right now we're just going over the basics. But these are our concentrations for wet rice farming, South and Southeast Asia. And specifically, if you want example countries, India's always I think, the go-to for thinking about regions in the East, right? Because it acts as this kind of southern point, right? If we were to draw a compass here, we'd be able to look at India as the south, and that is South Asia, and then just work the compass all around: Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, North Asia, so on and so forth, right? It's just a thing to know. Next, we have our mixed crop and livestock farming. Just as it sounds, it's going to be a mixture of crop raising and livestock farming. In this case, you're thinking about pigs and cows. And here we have what we call the Corn Belt in the United States. Right here we have, of course, Nebraska included, Minnesota as well, and Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, where we have the highest corn production in the world. Right, we have lots of corn. China is actually very close on that too, right? So this might have changed, but this is at the very least the highest amount of corn production in the U.S. Right, the two largest agricultural products out of the United States: corn and soybeans. Right, so if we're thinking about the products that are being produced, corn and soybeans are up there, and this is part of the areas where those products are grown in the United States. Right, a very important region to know: Corn Belt here. This is an intensive type of farming, and it is commercial, right? We're not growing a lot of cows and things to consume constantly, right? It's very difficult to eat 10 cows for one family. There's lots of meat and other stuff there. Same with dairy products, right? They're not going to just be drinking milk and eating beef, right? Having milk steak and stuff like that. So this is a commercial practice too, right? Intensive and commercial. And to go back, because we didn't mention in the previous one, rice farming is an intensive practice, right? It's a lot of work, a lot of effort to come in and terrace these products, and much of this farming is done by hand. And although much of the rice produced is sold, the farmers themselves are not selling the product to make profits. They're selling the products either to consume whatever is left, or in order to make enough money to subsist on the products they've sold, right? So they're not looking to make money off of what they're doing. The products are either directly going to their consumption for what they aren't able to sell, or the profits that they do make are only for the family to subsist and grow, right? We have lots of low-income, poor farmers in these regions, and it's typically who we see, right, in these rural areas. Our next type of farming is what we call market gardening or truck farming. And it's just as it sounds. This is where we're transporting a lot of goods by trucks, or where we're having goods very close to the markets themselves. It's a von Thunen foreshadowing for you. That'll be another video. And so here we were typically thinking of things like fruits and vegetables, strawberries, tomatoes, fruits and veggies in general. Where again, they're very delicate products. You're going to see a lot of these picked by hand. And so naturally, right, as you've been following along, it's going to fall into the intensive category. And of course, we're very fortunate, fingers crossed, that no one is solely consuming strawberries or tomatoes for their diets. And so this is also going to be commercial in nature. And the last type of agriculture for us, good old Texas ranching, which is what the U.S. and South America in particular are very famous for doing, which is ranching in general. Here we're looking at cattle ranching regions in specific. These are the Pampas, P-A-M-P-A-S, Pampas of South America, and in Argentina in this case. And ranching itself, if you've been thinking back to pastoral nomadism, thinking about the different types of agriculture we've looked at thus far, ranching is going to be very similar to pastoral nomadism in the sense that we're working with animals, and that we're working with animals being mostly free to graze, right, having to go over large expanses to eat and consume grass, vegetation, what have you. And this can apply to any types of ranching too. We're looking at cattle here because that's the most popular form that we see, but you can have llama ranches and goat ranches and sheep ranches. Those are all going to apply, right? But we have these large areas, so large amount of land, leaning to extensive. And the actual labor input isn't as great because maybe there's some herding, maybe there's some collecting involved of the animals themselves to keep them in a certain place. But the animals, for the most part, are consuming on their own and moving on their own, right? They're going to, wherever they are, whether it's a fenced-in area or not, and consuming the grass and vegetation, and that part is taken care of, right? Now, generally, when we think about what type of agriculture is being practiced in a specific region. There is a general climactic and geographic trend that we see. If it's something that requires or something that deals with fruits, crops, vegetables, it's going to be in areas that have large access to water sources, like coastlines or rivers, and that are going to have high soil quality, right? So these are all going to be very arable spaces of land, places where crops grow very well. But when we think about pastoral nomadism and ranching instead, these areas are not well suited for growing crops, right? And there are issues here, which we'll talk about in the Green Revolution, another piece of foreshadowing, of why these areas haven't benefited as much from new agriculture innovations. And part of that is the geographic conditions just weren't suited for large-scale, intensive agricultural production. So you default to something else, right? You still need to have food. You still need to be able to get food to feed your family and feed the people in your community. So you just adjust to the soil quality or the geographic quality of the space around you. In this case, maybe you can't grow a lot of crops, but you can raise a lot of animals who can eat all the grass and weeds and stuff, and still have a source of food and maybe source of income, right? Here with ranching too, we're looking at extensive farming, as we said, but of course we're not looking to eat 50 cows on their own, so they're not going to be performing ranching. Farmers who ranch aren't going to be performing ranching for the most part to subsist, but in order to sell their agricultural products, in this case the cows, sheep, goats, for a profit and to make money. That's been our basics of agriculture. We looked at types of agriculture, the different types that we look at in the course, the agricultural regions, climatic conditions for certain types of farming, intensive, extensive, commercial, and subsistence farming. Here's hoping you're happy, healthy, safe, that you are doing well, and we'll see you next time.